Alright friends, welcome back to a new set of chapters from Island of the Blue Dolphins. We only have about 9 chapters left, so let's make the best of it. Chapter 20. If you guys remember, the last few things that had happened with Corona is that she had attempted to catch the devilfish, and it didn't work out too well. Even though they were able to kill it, she and her dog were very much hurt by the end of it. So let's see what happens next. I gathered 2 more canoe loads of abalones soon after that, mostly the sweet red ones, which I cleaned and carried to the house. Along the south part of the fence, where the sun shone most of the day, I built long shelves out of branches and put the meat up to dry. Abalones are larger than your hand and twice as thick when fresh, but they shrink small in the sun, so you have to dry many. In the old days on the island, there were children to keep away the gulls, which would rather feast on abalones than anything else. And one morning, if the meat was left unguarded, they could fly off with a month's harvest. At first, whenever I went to the spring or to the beach, I left Rontu behind to chase them off, but he did not like this and howled all the time that I was gone. Finally, I tied strings to some of the abalone shells and hung them from poles. The insides of the shells are bright and catch the sun as they turn one way and another in the wind. After that, I had little trouble with the gulls. I also caught a small fish in a net and I had made and hung them up to dry for winter light. With meat drying on the shelves and the shells flashing and turning in the wind and the strings of fish hanging on the fence, the yard looked as if a whole village were living there on the headland instead of just Rontu and me. Every morning, after I had gathered food for the winter, we went out on the sea. At the end of the summer, I would gather roots and seeds to store, but now there was nothing that needed to be done. We went many places those first days of summer, to the beach where the sea elephants lived, to the black cave, which was even larger than the first cave we found, and to Tall Rock, where the cormorants roasted. Tall Rock was more than a league from the island, and was black and shimmering because it was covered with cormorants. I killed 10 of the birds the first time I went there, and I skinned and fleshed them and put them out to dry, for someday I wanted to make myself a skirt of cormorant feathers. Black Cave was on the south coast of the island, near the place where the canoes were stored. In front of the cave was a high ledge of rocks surrounded by deep kelp beds, and I would have paddled by it if I had not seen a hawk fly out. The sun was in the west, and I had a long way to go to reach home, but I was curious about the hawk and the place that he lived in. The opening of the cave was small, like the one in the cave under the headland, and Rontu and I had to crouch low to get through. Weak light came from outside, and I saw that we were in a room with black shining walls that curved high overhead. At the far end of the room was another small opening. It was long and very dark, but when we reached the end of it, we were in another room, which was larger than the first and lit with a shaft of light. The light came from the sun, which shone down through a jagged crack in the ceiling. Seeing the sun shining down and the black shadows drifting over the walls, Rontu barked, then began to howl. The sound echoed through the cave like the howling of a whole pack of dogs. It sent a cold feeling down my back. "Be quiet!" I shouted, putting my hand over his jaws. My words echoed and echoed in the room. I turned the canoe around and started back towards the opening. Above it, on a deep ledge that ran from one side of the room to the other, my gaze fell upon a row of strange figures. There must have been 24 of them standing against the black wall. They were as tall as I, with long arms and legs and short bodies made of reeds and clothed in gull feathers. Each one had eyes fashioned of round or oblong discs of abalone shell, but the rest of their faces were blank. The eyes glittered down at me, moved as the light on the water moved and was reflected upon them. They were more alive than the eyes of those who live. In the middle of the group was a seated figure, a skeleton. It sat leaning against the wall with its knees drawn up and its fingers, which were raised to its mouth, a flute of pelican bone. There were other things there on the ledge, in the shadows among the standing figures, but having drifted far back in the room, I again paddled toward the opening. I had forgotten that the tide was coming in. To my great surprise, the opening had narrowed. It was too small for me to get through. We would have to stay in the room until the tide went out, until dawn came. I paddled to the far end of the cave, and I did not look back at the glittering eyes of the figures on the ledge. I crouched in the bottom of the canoe, and I watched the shaft of light grow weak. The opening out of the sea grew smaller and finally disappeared. Night came, and a star shone through the crevice overhead. This star passed out of sight, and another took its place. The tide lifted the canoe higher in the room, and as the water lapped against the walls, it sounded like the soft music of a flute. It played many tunes through the long night, and I slept little, watching the stars change. I knew that the skeleton who sat on the ledge playing his flute was one of my ancestors, and the others, with the glittering eyes, though only images, were too. But still I was sleepless and afraid. With the first light, another high tide almost setting, we left the cave. I did not look up at those standing quietly on the ledge, or at the flute player playing for them, but paddled fast out into the morning sea, nor did I look back. "I suppose that this cave once had a name," I said to Rontu, who was glad to be free as I was. "But I have never heard of it, or heard it spoken about. We will call it Black Cave, and never in all our days go there again." When we came back from our voyage to Tall Rock, I hid the canoe in the cave below the headland. It was hard work, but each time I would lift the canoe from the water and onto the ledge, even though I planned to go out the next morning. 2 summers had come and gone, and the Aleut hunters had not returned. Yet during these days I always looked for them. At dawn, as Rontu and I went down to the cliff, I would watch the ocean for their sails. The summer air was clear, and I could see many leagues. Whenever we went into the canoe, I would never be gone longer than half a day. On the way home, I always paddled close to the shore and looked for them. It was the last time that we went to Tall Rock that the Aleuts came. I had hidden the canoe and climbed the cliff with 10 cormorant skins slung over my back. At the top of the cliff, I stood for a while gazing at the sea. There were some small clouds on the water. One of them, the smallest, did not look like the others, and as I watched, I saw that it was a ship. The sun made bright scales on the water, but I could see clearly. There were 2 sails, and it was a ship coming toward the island. For a long time I could not tell the color of the sails. I wondered if it could be the white men, though now I thought about them little and seldom looked for them. I left the cormorants hanging on the fence and went to the rock on the headland. I could see no better from the rock because the sun was very low, and the whole ocean was covered with light. Then, as I stood there, I remembered that the white men's ship would come from the east. This one had come from a different direction, from the north. I still was not sure that it belonged to the Aleuts, but I decided to pack things that I would take to the cave in the ravine. There was much to take. My 2 birds, the skirt I had made, the stone utensils, my beads and earrings, the cormorant feathers, and all of my baskets and weapons. The abalones were not yet dry, so I would have to leave them. When I had packed everything, and I put it beside the hole under the fence, I went back to the headland. I lay on the rock so that I would not be seen, and peered over its rim towards the north. For a moment I did not find the ship, and then I saw that it had traveled faster than I thought it would. It was already rounding the kelp bed, close to the rocks of Coral Cove. The last of the sun shone on the ship, and the bow, which was made like the beak of a bird, and on the 2 red sails. I knew that the Aleuts would not come on the shore in the dark, and that I had until morning to carry my things to the cave, but I did not wait. Most of the night I worked, making 2 trips to the cave. At dawn, when everything had been moved, I went back to the house for the last time, and there I buried the ashes of my fires, and threw sand over the shelves on the floor. I took down the shells that I had put up to scare the gulls, and I tossed them in the abalones over the cliff. At last, with a pelican wing, I brushed away the marks of my feet. When I had finished, it looked as though no one had lived there for a long time. But now the sun was up, and I climbed onto the rock. The ship lay at the anchor in the cove. Canoes were bringing goods to the shore, and some were out in the kelp beds, beginning to hunt for otter. There was a fire on the shore beside it, a girl. She was cooking something, and I could see the fire shining on her hair. I did not stay long on the headland. All was in the past. I had gone to the ravine by a different way, so as not to wear a trail. This time I went off toward the west, along the cliff, and then doubled back through the brush, being careful to leave no tracks. Rontu's prints did not matter, because the Aleuts knew that there were dogs on the island. The cave was very dark, and I had trouble getting Rontu to go through the small opening. Only after I had crawled in and out several times would he follow me. I closed the opening with stones, and since I was tired, lay down and slept all that day. I slept until I could see the stars shining between the cracks in the rocks. All right, guys, on to the next chapter, chapter 21. I did not take Rontu with me when I left the cave that night, and I closed the opening so that he would not follow me, for if the Aleuts had brought their dogs, he would surely smell them out. I went quietly through the brush to the headland. Before I had climbed to the top of the high rock, I could see the glow of the Aleut fires. They had camped on the mesa at the place and the spring that they had used before. It was less than half a league from my cave. I stood for a long time watching the fires, wondering if I should move to another part of the island, perhaps to the cave where the wild dogs had lived. I was not afraid that the men would discover me, because they worked on the beach or hunted in their canoes all day. It was the girl that I was afraid of. The ravine was tangled with brush, which was hard to walk through, but in the ravine grew seeds and roots. Sometime, when she was out looking for food, she might wander by the spring and see that it was being used and find my steps leading to the cave. I stood on the rock until the Aleut fires died. I thought of everything that I could do, of the different places I could go, and at last decided to stay in the ravine. The far end of the island had no springs, and if I moved there, I would have no place to hide the canoe, which I might need. I went back to the cave, and I did not leave it until the moon was full. There was little food left. Rontu and I climbed to the headland, and when we passed the house, I saw that 3 of the whale ribs had been cut from the fence. No one was there, or else Rontu would have barked. I waited until the tide was low, which was close to dawn, and I filled a basket with seawater and abalones. We were back in the cave before it grew light. The seawater kept the abalones fresh, but when we had to go out again, the night was so dark to find our way to the reef. I therefore had to gather roots. I could never gather many before the sun rose, so I went out every morning until the next moon came. Then I went to the reef for abalones. During all the time I saw none of the Aleuts, nor did the girl come near the cave, though I found her footsteps far down the ravine where she had been to dig roots. The Aleuts had not brought their dogs, which was fortunate, for they would have found Rontu's tracks and followed us to the cave. The days were long for Rontu and me. At first he would pace up and down the cave and stand at the opening sniffing through the cracks. I could not let him out except when I was with him, for fear that he would go to the camp and would not come back. After a while he got used to this, and would lie all day, watching whatever I was doing. It was dark in the cave, even when the sun was high, so I burned the small fish I had stored. By their light I began to make a cormorant skirt, working every day on it. The 10 skins I had taken at Tall Rock were now dry, and in a condition to sew. All of them were from male cormorants, whose feathers are thicker than those of the females and much glossier. The skirt of yucca fibers was simple to make. I wanted this one to be better, so I cut the skins carefully, and I sewed them with great care. I made the bottom first, putting the skins end to end, and using 3 of them. For the rest of the skirt, I sewed the others along their sides, so that the feathers ran one way on the upper part and a different way along the bottom. It was a beautiful skirt, and I finished it on the day after the second moon. I had burned all the little fish, and since I could catch no more until the Aleuts left, I took the skirt outside to work on it there. I had found footsteps to the ravine twice again after the first time, but no closer to the cave. I had begun to feel safe, for the winter storms would soon be here and the Aleuts would leave. Before another moon, they would be gone. I had never seen the skirt in the sunlight. It was black, but underneath were green and gold colors, and all the feathers shimmered as though they were on fire. It was more beautiful than I thought it would be. I worked fast now that it was almost finished, yet from time to time I would stop to hold it against my waist. "Rontu," I said, feeling giddy with happiness, "if you were not a male dog, I would make you one too, as beautiful as this." Rontu, who was sprawled out on the mouth of the cave, raised his head and yawned at me and went back to sleep. I was standing in the sunlight, holding the skirt to my waist, when Rontu leaped to his feet. I heard the sound of steps. It came from the direction of the spring, and as I turned quickly I saw a girl looking down at me from the brush. My spear stood beside the mouth of the cave within easy reach. The girl was not more than 10 paces from me, and with one movement I could have picked up the spear and thrown it. Why I did not throw the spear I do not know, for she was one of the Aleuts who had killed my people on the beach of Coral Cove. She said something, and Rontu left the mouth of the cave and walked slowly towards her, the hair raised on his neck. But then he walked to where she stood and let her touch him. The girl looked at me, and made a motion with her hands, which I took to mean that Rontu was hers. "No!" I cried and shook my head. I picked up my spear. She started to turn, and I thought that she was going to flee back through the brush. She made another motion, and that one I took to mean that Rontu was now mine. I did not believe her. I held the spear over my shoulder, ready to throw. "Tutuk," she said, pointing to herself. I did not say my name. I called Rontu, and he came back. The girl looked at him, and then at me, and smiled. She was older than I, but not so tall. She had a broad face and small eyes that were very black. When she smiled, I saw that her teeth were worn down from chewing seal sinew, but they were very white. I was still holding the cormorant skirt, and the girl pointed to it and said something. There was one word, "Winsha," which sounded like a word that means pretty in our language. I was so proud of the skirt that I did not think. The spear was in my hand, but I held up the skirt so the sunlight could shine on all of it. The girl jumped down from the ledge and came over to me and touched it. "Winsha," she said, again. I did not say the word, but she wanted to hold the skirt, and I gave it to her. She put it against her waist and let it fall from her hips, turning one way around and then the other. She was graceful, and the skirt flowed around her like water, but I hated the alludes, and I took it from her. "Winsha," she said. I had not heard words spoken for so long that they sounded strange to me, yet they were good to hear, even though it was an enemy who spoke them. She said other words that I did not understand, but now, as she spoke, she looked over my shoulder toward the cave. She pointed to the cave and then to me, and made gestures as if she were making a fire. I knew what she wanted me to say, but I did not say it. She wished to know if I lived there in the cave so that she could come back with the men and take me to their camp. I shook my head and pointed to the far end of the island, away, for I did not trust her. She kept looking toward the cave, but she said nothing more about it. I held the spear, which I could have thrown. I did not, though. I feared that she would return with the hunters. She came over to me and touched my arm. I did not like the feel of her hand. She said more words and smiled again, and walked to the spring and drank. The next moment she had disappeared in the brush. Rontu did not try to follow her. She made no noise as she went. I crawled back to the cave and began to pack the things I owned. I had all the day to do it because the men were working and would not return to their camp before night. By nightfall, I was ready to go. I planned to take my canoe and to go to the west part of the island. I could sleep there on the rocks until the Aleuts left, moving from place to place if I needed to. I carried 5 baskets up the ravine, and I hid them near my house. It was getting dark, and I had to go back to the cave for the 2 that were left. Carefully, I crawled through the brush and stopped just above the mouth of the cave, and I listened. Rontu was beside me, and he listened also. No one could go through the brush in the dusk without making a sound, except someone who had lived in it for a long time. I went past the spring, and I waited, and then onto the cave. I felt that someone had been there while I had been away. They could be hiding in the dark watching me. They were waiting until I went into the cave. I was afraid, so I did not go in, but quickly turned around. As I did, I saw something in front of the cave, on the flat rock I used for a step. It was a necklace of black stones of a kind that I had never seen. Chapter 22. I did not go into the cave, nor did I take the necklace from the rock. That night I slept on the headland at the place where I had left my baskets. At dawn I went back to the ravine, and there I hid myself on a brushy ledge. It was near the spring, and from it that I could see the mouth of the cave. The sun rose and shone through the ravine. I could see the necklace lying on the rock. The stones looked blacker than they had in the darkness, and there were many of them. I wanted to go down to the cave and count them, to see if they would make 2 loops around my neck, but I did not leave the ledge. I stayed there all the morning. The sun was high when Rontu barked, and I heard steps below me. The girl came out of the brush singing. She walked to the cave, but when she saw the necklace lying on the rock, she grew quiet. She picked up the necklace, and she put it down again, and she peered into the mouth of the cave. 2 of my baskets were still there. Then she went and drank from the spring, and started through the brush. I jumped to my feet. "Tutuk!" I cried, running down the ravine. "Tutuk!" She came out of the brush so quickly that she must have been waiting nearby to see if I would return. I ran to the rock, and I put on the necklace and turned around for her to admire it. The beads made not 2 loops, but 3. They were long and oval instead of round, which is a very hard shape to make, and it takes much skill. "Winsha," she said. "Winsha." I said after her, the word strange on my tongue, and then I said the word that meant pretty in our language. Wintai, she said, and laughed, because this was strange to her. She touched the necklace, giving the word for it, and I gave mine. We pointed out other things, the spring, the cave, a gull flying, the sun, and the sky, Rontu asleep, trading the names for them, and laughing because they were so different. We sat there on the rock until the sun was in the west, and played this game. Then Tutuk rose and made a gesture of farewell. Mane, she said, and wanted to hear my name. Wanapale, I answered, which, as I have said, means the girl with the long black hair. I did not tell her my secret name. Mane, Wanapale, she said. Pase no Tutuk, I replied. I watched her go through the brush. I stood for a long time listening to her footsteps, until I could hear them no more, and then I went to the headland and brought the baskets back to the cave. Tutuk came again the next day. We sat on the rocks in the bright sun, trading words and laughing. The sun went fast in the sky. The time came soon when she had to leave, but she returned on the day that followed. It was on this day, when she was leaving, that I told her my secret name. Korana, I said, pointing to myself. She repeated the word, but she did not understand what it meant. Wanapale? She said, frowning. I shook my head, pointing again to myself, and I said, Korana. Her black eyes opened wide. Slowly she began to smile. Pase no Korana, she said. That night I began to make a gift for her, in return for the necklace that she had given me. At first I thought I would give her a pair of my bone earrings, but remembering that her ears were not pierced, and that I had a basket of abalone shells already flaked into thin discs, I set about making a circlet for her hair. I bored 2 holes in each of the discs, using thorns and fine sand. Between them I put 10 olivella shells, which were no longer than the tip of my little finger, and I threaded them all together with sinew. I worked 5 nights on the circlet, and on the 5th day, when she came, I gave it to her, putting it around her head and tying it in the back. Winsha, she said, and hugged me. She was so pleased that I forgot how sore my fingers were from boring the holes into the hard shells. Many times she came out of the cave, and then one morning she did not come. I waited for her all that day, and at dusk I left the cave, and I went to the ledge where I could watch the ravine, fearing that the men had learned that I lived here and would find me. That night I slept on the ledge. The night was cold, with the first wind of winter. Tutuk did not return the next day, and I remembered that it was near the time when the Aleut hunters would leave. Perhaps they had already gone. That afternoon I went to the headland. I climbed the rock, and I crawled across it until I could look over the rim. My heart beat loud. The Aleut ship was still there, but the men were working on the deck, and canoes were going back and forth. The wind blew hard, and few bales of otter skins lay on the shore, so probably the ship would leave at dawn. It was dark when I got back to the ravine. Since the wind was very cold and I was no longer afraid that the Aleuts would find me, I made a fire in the cave and I cooked a supper of shellfish and roots. I cooked enough for Rontu and me and for Tutuk. I knew Tutuk would not come, yet I put her food beside the fire and I waited. Once Rontu barked, and I thought I heard the sound of a footstep, and went to the opening and listened. I waited a long while and did not eat. Clouds moved from the north, covering the cold sky. The wind grew louder and made wild noises in the ravine. At last I closed the mouth of the cave with stones. At dawn I went to the headland. The wind had died. Fog lay over the sea, washing against the island in gray waves. I waited a long time for a glimpse of Coral Cove, but finally the sun burned away the fog. The little harbor was deserted. The Aleut ships, with its red-beaked prow and red sails, had gone. At first, knowing that I could now leave the cave and move back into my house on the headland, I was happy. But as I stood there on the high rock, looking down at the deserted harbor and the empty seas, I began to think of Tutuk. I thought of all the times that we'd sat in the sun together. I could hear her voice and see her black eyes squinting closed when she laughed. Below me, Rontu was running along the cliff, barking at the screaming gulls. Pelicans were chattering as they fished the blue water. Far off, I could hear the bellow of a sea elephant. But suddenly, as I thought of Tutuk, the island seemed very quiet. Chapter 23. The hunters left many wounded otter behind them, Some floated in and died on the shore, and others I killed with my spear since they were suffering and could not live. But I found a young otter that was not badly hurt. It lay in a bed of kelp, and I would have paddled by it if Rontu had not barked. A strand of kelp was wound around its body, and I thought it was sleeping, for often they go to sleep where they anchor themselves in this way to keep from drifting off. Then I saw that there was a deep gash across its back. The otter did not try to swim away as I drew near, and reached over the side of the canoe. They have large eyes, especially when they're young, but this one's were so large from fear and pain that I could see my reflection in them. I cut the kelp that held it, and I took it to a tide pool behind the reef, which was sheltered from the waves. The day was calm after the storm, and I had caught 2 fish along the reef. I was careful to keep them alive, because otter will not eat anything that is dead, and I left them in the pool. This was early in the morning. That afternoon I went back to the pool. The fish had disappeared, and the young otter was asleep, floating on its back. I did not try to treat its wound with herbs, because salt water heals, and the herbs would have washed off anyway. I brought 2 fish every day, and I left them in the pool. The otter would not eat while I was watching, and then I brought 4 fish, and these also disappeared, and finally 6, which seemed to be the right number. I brought them whether the day was calm or stormy. The otter grew, and its wound began to heal. But still, it stayed in the pool, and now, when I came, it would be waiting for me, and would take the fish from my hand. The pool was not big, and it could easily have gotten out and away into the sea, yet it stayed there, and slept or waited for me to come with food. The young otter was now the length of my arm, and very glossy. It had a long nose that came to a point, and many whiskers on each side, and the largest eyes I have ever seen. They would watch me all the time that I was at the pool, following me whatever I did, and when I said something, they would move around in a very funny way, and a way too that made pain come to my throat, because they were so happy, yet they were sad also. For a long time I called it otter, as I had called Rontu dog, and then I decided to give the otter a name. The name was Monini, which means little boy with large eyes. It was a hard task catching fish every day, especially if the wind was blowing and the waves were high. Once, when I could catch only 2 and drop them into the pool, Monini ate them quickly and waited for more. When he found that was all I had, he swam around in circles, looking at me reproachfully. The waves were high the next day that I could not fish on the reef, even at low tide, and since I had nothing to give him, I did not go to the pool. It was 3 days before I could catch fish, and when I went there again, the pool was deserted. I knew that he would leave some day, but I felt bad that he had gone back to the sea and that I would never catch fish for him again. Nor would I know him if I ever saw him again in the kelp, for now that he had grown and his wound had healed, he looked like all the others. Soon after the Aleuts had left, I moved back to the headland. Nothing had been harmed except the fence, which I mended, and in a few days the house was the same as it was before. The only thing that worried me was that all the abalones I had gathered in the summer were gone. I would need to live from day to day on what I could catch, trying to get just enough on the days when I could fish to last through the times when I could not, through the first part of the winter before Monini swam away. This was sometimes hard to do. Afterwards it was not so hard, and Rontu and I always had enough to eat. While the Aleuts were on the island, I had no chance to catch little smelts and dry them, so the nights that winter were dark, and I went to bed early and worked only during the day, but still I made another string for my fishing spear, many hooks of abalone shell, and last of all earrings to match the necklace Tutuk had given me. These took a long time, for I searched the beach many mornings when the tide was out before I found 2 pebbles of the same color as the stones in the necklace and soft enough to cut. The holes in the earrings took even more time, for the stones were hard to hold, and when I was done and had rubbed them bright in fine sand and water and fastened them with bone hooks to fit my ears, they were very pretty. On sunny days I would wear them with my cormorant dress and the necklace, and walk along the cliff with Rontu. I often thought of Tutuk, but on these days especially, I would look off into the north and wish that she were here to see me. I could hear her talking in her strange language, and I would make up things to say to her, and things for her to say to me. Chapter 24. Spring again was a time of flowers, and water ran in the ravines and flowed down to the sea. Many birds came back to the island. Tainer and Lurai built a nest in the tree where they were born. They built it of dry seaweed and leaves, and also of the hairs of Ratu's back. Whenever he was in the yard while it was being made, they would swoop down as if he was not looking and snatch a beakful of fur and fly away. This he did not like, and he finally hid from them until the nest was finished. I had been right in giving a girl's name to Lurai, for she had laid speckled eggs, and with some help from her mate, hatched 2 ugly fledglings, which soon became beautiful. I made up names for them, and I clipped their wings, and before long they were as tame as their parents. I also found a young gull that had fallen from its nest to the beach below. Gulls make their nests high on the cliffs, and in hollow places on the rocks. These places were usually small, and often I had watched a young one teetering on the edge of the nest and wondered why it did not fall. They seldom did. This one, which was white with a yellow beak, was not badly hurt, but he had broken a leg. I took him back to the house, and I bound the bones together with 2 small sticks and sinew. For a while he did not try to walk, and then, because he was not old enough to fly, he began to hobble around the yard. With the young birds and the old ones, the white gull and Rantu, who was always trotting at my heels, the yard seemed like a happy place. If only I had not remembered Tutuk. If only I had not wondered about my sister Ulape, where she was, and if the marks she was drawn upon her cheeks had proved magical. If they had, she was now married to Nanko, and was the mother of many children. She would have smiled to see all of mine, which were so different from the ones that I had always wished to have. Early that spring, I started to gather abalones, and I gathered together many, taking them to the headland to dry. I wanted to have a good supply ready if the Aleuts came again. One day, when I was on the reef filling my canoe, I saw a herd of otter in the kelp nearby. They were chasing each other, putting their heads through the kelp, and then going under and coming up in different places. It was like a game we used to play in the brush when we were children on the island. I looked for Monane, but each one of them seemed like the other. I filled my canoe with abalones, and I paddled towards the shore. One of the otters started following me. As I stopped, he dived and then came up in front of me. He was far away, yet even then I knew who it was. I never thought that I would be able to tell him from the others, but I was so sure that it was Monane that I held up one of the fish that I had caught. Otters swim very fast, and before I could take a breath, he had snatched it from my hand. For 2 moons I did not see him, and then one morning, while I was fishing, he came suddenly out of the kelp. Behind him were 2 baby otter. They were about the size of puppies, and they moved along so slowly that from time to time Monane had to urge them on. Sea otters cannot swim when they are first born, and have to hold on to their mother. Little by little, she teaches her babies by brushing them away with her flippers, then swimming around them in circles until they learn to follow. Monane came close to the reef, and I threw a fish into the water. He did not snatch it as he usually did, but waited to see what the young otter would do. When they seemed more interested in me than in the food, and the fish started to swim away, he seized it with his sharp teeth and he tossed it in front of them. I threw another fish in the water for Monane, but he did the same thing as before. Still the babies would not take the food, and at last, tired of playing with it, swam over and began to nuzzle him. Only then did I know that Monane was their mother. Otters mate for life, and if the mother dies, the father will often raise the babies as best he can. This is what I had thought had happened to Monane. I looked down at the little family swimming beside the reef. Monane, I said, I'm going to give you a new name. It is Wonane, which fits you better because it means girl with large eyes. The young otter grew fast, and soon they were taking fish from my hand, but Wonane liked abalones better. She would let the abalone I tossed to sink to the bottom, and then dive and come up holding it against her body, with the rock held in her mouth. Then she would float on her back and put the abalone on her breast, and strike it again and again with the rock until the shell was broken. She taught her young to do this, and sometimes I sat on the reef all morning and watched the 3 of them pounding the hard shells against their breasts. If all the otters did not eat abalones this way, I would have thought that it was a game played by Wonane just to please me. But they all did, and I always wondered about it. and I wonder to this time. After that summer, after being friends with Wonane and her young, I never killed another otter. I had an otter cape for my shoulders which I used until it wore out, but never again did I make a new one, nor did I ever kill another cormorant for its beautiful feathers, though they have long, thin necks and make ugly sounds when they talk to each other. Nor did I kill seals for their sinews, using instead kelp to bind the things that I needed it. Nor did I kill another wild dog, nor did I try to spear another sea elephant. Ulape would have laughed at me, and others would have laughed too, my father most of all. Yet this is the way that I felt about the animals who had become my friends, and those who were not, but in time could be. If Ulape and my father had come back and laughed, and all the others had come back and laughed, still I would have felt the same way. For animals and birds are like people, too, though they do not talk the same or do the same things. Without them, the earth would be an unhappy place. Guys, that does it for this week's chapters. Next week we will finish the book. We only have about 4 chapters to go. All right, see you then. Don't forget to do the quiz.